Hello and welcome to the CNSS Podcast. My name is Moksha and I am a non-resident visiting senior scholar at the Center for National Security Studies. Our guest for today's episode is Bertil Lintner, a Swedish journalist, author and strategic consultant who has been writing about Asia for nearly 4 decades. Mr. Lintner was the Far East Economic Review's Burma correspondent and the Asia correspondent for Swedish daily Svenska Dagbladet. He has written 10 books on Myanmar and larger Asian geopolitics.
Hello, Mr. Lintner. Welcome back to the CSS Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been almost 5 years since the Myanmar coup, and the country is now going to the polls for the very first time, with the first phase of voting having taken place on December 28th. Could you please describe for our audience the political and security context in which the first phase of the elections has taken place?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. But it is quite obvious why the elections are being held in 3 phases. It's because the military cannot provide what they would call security out of in all parts of the country, but only 6 of them are participating in elections all over the country. And of those 6 parties, 5 are what I would consider military parties. It's the Union Solidarity and Development Party, the main one, 4 allies. And then the 6th party is the People Party, which was set up by one of the veterans of the 1988 uprising, Kokoji. But he has been unwilling to, be too critical of the military. And the popularity he once enjoyed is no longer the same. And he's considered to be fairly close to the military as well. From what I've heard from people inside the country is that they feel that they have to vote, because if they don't, they might get into trouble. Because the military is keeping all its population record. They can easily see who has voted and who has not voted at all. And people I talked to, they said that we had to go and vote, because if we didn't, we're afraid that we'll be punished afterwards. But even so, it seems that the turnout has been fairly low. It's nothing compared to what it was in 2015 or 2020. Now, of course, elections have been held only in major cities like the old capital Yangon and Mandalay up in central Myanmar. But there, nobody has reported any kind of enthusiasm for this election, because everybody knows what's going to happen. That the military basically wants legitimacy for its rule. They want to abolish the old junta and replace it with a government made up of army officers who have donned their uniforms for civilian clothes. And most of the USDP candidates are also former military officers.
Right. Is the low turnout possibly because of how fragmented the country's territory is now, with, some ethnic armed organizations and rebel groups establishing de facto administrative, military and economic control over large regions? And if you could just touch upon.
Well, I think the most important thing with this election is not who is going to vote and who is not going to vote and where they're going to vote and not. It's the geopolitical fallout of the election. Because I don't think anyone outside Myanmar really believes that this is a fair and fair election. But the election is going to be very different in different parts of the world. And that is what I think is going to be more important for the future of the country. If you look at the West, they're going to take the moral high ground. They're going to say this is bad, we don't accept this is not a free and fair election, and blah, blah, blah. But honestly, that's not going to have any impact at all on the situation inside the country. Because the opposition there, and we're talking about the armed opposition, it's very fragmented. There's no unified opposition. You got an abundance of ethnic groups, and they're mostly concerned with their own respective areas. I mean, we take the Kachin Independence Army, for instance. They've allied themselves with some Burman opposition groups and armed them. But those Burman groups are basically, from a Kachin point of view, they're a buffer to keep the Myanmar army at bay. The KIA, the Kachin Independence Army, has no interest of marching into Mandalay or Naypyidaw or Yangon. But the same goes for most of the other ethnic groups. And even among the ethnic groups, there's no unity. If you take Chin State, which is very close to Mizoram, naturally, you have different Chin factions fighting each other. There's several armies which cannot even agree on what they want to do in their own state. And the Burman armies are not particularly well-trained, well-equipped, and effective. But then, of course, you have the major factor here, the most important factor, that's the China factor. Because they become into the long-term, geostrategic side of things. And for China, Myanmar is the outlet to the Indian Ocean. It doesn't really matter who is in power in Naypyidaw, as long as they can maintain very close and friendly relations with that government. The Chinese have decided that it's going to be the military, that the military will be there for the foreseeable future. So therefore, the Chinese have put pressure on several of the ethnic armed groups to enter into ceasefire agreements with the government. I mean, only about a year ago, it looked as if the armed resistance was about to take over large chunks of northern Shan State. They captured the regional headquarters of the military in Lashio. They took Chokmei and Sipo, other towns on the major trade route between China and Mandalay. But then, of course, it was not in China's interest to have it that way. So they put pressure on these groups to pull back and to enter into ceasefire agreements with the government. And the Chinese were able to do that because of the close relationship with another army, the United One State Army. It is armed and equipped by China, but has been in a ceasefire, had a ceasefire agreement with the Myanmar military since 1989. And they have established their own kind of buffer state, you can call it that, along the Chinese frontier. The ones supplied these groups are talking about the Kokang group, the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army, and the Ta'ang National Liberation Army. It's made up of ethnic Palau with weapons and ammunition for the initial stage of the war. And the reason why they did that was not because they really want to overthrow the government in Naypyidaw. It was because a number of scam centers have been set up in the areas primarily in Kokang, but not in the areas controlled by these armed groups, but by local militias allied with the Myanmar military. And in the beginning, the Chinese told the Myanmar military to do something about it, but they didn't. It was just some half-hearted attempt to wipe them out. And then I think the Chinese told them, get rid of it. Supply the MNDAA and the TNLA with weapons. And they did. And they did so very effectively. The scam centers were closed down. They were shut down. But then they became a little bit too successful. So they marched on and were threatening Pinolwin, major garrison town northeast of Mandalay. Then the Chinese thought, no, enough is enough. Now they have to pull back. That is actually what happened. And now you can say there is not much fighting in that area now. And the Burman groups, which are allied with the TNLA and MNDAA, have been forced into, not to surrender, but at least not to fight to the same extent as before, because they can't. They are totally dependent on those two ethnic groups, and those two ethnic groups in turn are dependent on the war. So you can say that China has managed to establish some kind of peace in large tracts of the northern Myanmar. Kachin state is a bit different because there you got the KIA, which is also heavily dependent on China not for weapons, but for all other kind of supplies, petrol, diesel, medical supplies, food, and so on. And they've also come under pressure from China to enter into some kind of agreement with the Myanmar military. If they're going to succeed or not, I'm not sure, because after all, the Kachins have other options. They're not totally dependent on China. The area which they control stretches all the way from the Chinese border to the Indian border, and a bit far south as well. But what I think we're going to see now, when the Chinese have managed to neutralize several of these forces in the north, there's only one army that remains, a major threat to the Myanmar military, this Arakan army in Rakhine State. And that is going to be very difficult because AA has already taken over most of Rakhine State, but not Chakpyu, where the Chinese have the big deep sea port project and all that. It's going to be the end of this pipeline, so to speak, from China to the Indian Ocean. And I think the AA have hesitated to attack Chakpyu because they cannot afford to antagonize the Chinese either. Because the AA leadership is based in Lhasa and Kachin State, and not in Rakhine State. And when they travel to the war headquarters at Pangsang or Pangkam, as it is called now, they have to travel through China. They don't walk all the way down there. That's not the question. So the Chinese have a close relationship with the AA as well. And therefore, there's been no attack on Chakpyu. But the Arakan army is having some advantages as well. And that is, if you just look at the geography, Rakhine State is sheltered by the Arakan Yoma, a mountain range that stretches between the borders of Rakhine State and the rest of Myanmar. There are very few roads into Rakhine State from Myanmar proper, if you may call it that. And therefore, the Myanmar army has to depend on air power and even naval power to bombard the AA positions from the sea. They can't really move troops in there to push the AA out of Rakhine State, overland, so to speak. But I think that Rakhine State will be the next target for the Myanmar army, regardless of all those kind of difficulties. But by and large, I'm saying that this is not just an election and who's going to sit in Naypyidaw. It is which power is going to have influence, outside power is going to influence over Myanmar in the future, in the immediate future. Then you have China, the main country, of course. But then you have India. And India, of course, is not particularly pleased about that. So India is also moving closer to the Myanmar military. And although I don't think anyone in India believes that these elections are free and fair, but it doesn't really matter. For geostrategic reasons, India will cooperate as much as it possibly can with the Myanmar military. And India has also other security concerns, not only the degree of Chinese influence in Myanmar. If you look at northwestern Sagaing region, there are still insurgent groups from the India's northeast based there. Ulfa, which is not as strong as the United Liberation Front of Assam. It's not as strong as it used to be, but they're still there. The Manipuri groups, the Naga groups, and they have in the past launched cross-border raids into India. And the only way the India can possibly contain this would be to cooperate with the Myanmar military. So there are a number of reasons why India would like to have good connections with the next government, and therefore they're not going to criticize the outcome of the election. It's highly unlikely. Then you have Bangladesh. Bangladesh is starting with about 1 million now Rohingya refugees in the areas to the southeast of Chittagong. And there were about 750,000 maybe fled, mainly 2017. But then, of course, a lot of people, children have been born in the camps, and there's been a trickle of refugees coming in as well. Bangladesh cannot afford to absorb 1 million refugees. It's sort of becoming an immense burden. And are they going to be repatriated or not? Well, it is not likely to happen. But in any event, in order to negotiate some kind of repatriation, gradual or more substantial, the Bangladesh government would have to negotiate with whoever is in power in Naypyidaw. The problem there, of course, is that the entire border in Bangladesh is controlled by the Arakan army. But they can't really talk to the Arakan army about repatriated Rohingyas. So Bangladesh is likely to recognize the outcome of the election as well. Then you have ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, but they have two guiding principles. One is non-interference, the other is consensus. So they're not going to do anything, and they haven't done anything so far either. They got what they call this 5-point consensus, which was agreed upon several years ago, but the Myanmar military has simply ignored it. And they can't, because there's no way the ASEAN has the mechanism or the power or the authority whatever to intervene and enforce those 5 points, which are not particularly harsh anyway. So by and large, I think what we will see after the election, when it's all over, is that a gradual acceptance of the new government as legitimate in the eyes of the outside powers that really matter. That is, Myanmar's immediate neighbors. The West is irrelevant in this context.
Right, and I think this is something you touched upon in your recent article in Global Asian. So we'll link it down for our audience in the description box so they can first have a look at it. And could you also briefly touch upon what the Buddhist Sangha in Myanmar is doing in this political context? Because I think historically they've been politically active, but how have they been reacting since the coup, and what do they think of the elections happening right now?
Yeah, the Sangha in Burma, or Myanmar, is a very powerful institution, and there's always been historically as well. Some years ago, I was asked by Human Rights Watch to write a report on kind of the history of political Buddhism in Myanmar. And Human Rights Watch thought that, well, what kind of connection do they have with the Thai Sangha? I said, no, forget about that. They have no connections at all. They're vastly different. The ethnic Shans who are related to the Thais, yes, their Sangha has been, it's been close to the Thai Sangha, especially after Chiang Mai. But if you look at the rest of the country, I said, don't look at Thailand, look at Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka also has a long history of political Buddhism. And if you look at the so-called Saffron Revolution in 2017, there were close connections between the Sanghas in Myanmar and Sri Lanka at the time. So after a lot of skepticism, Human Rights Watch agreed to send me to Sri Lanka to look into this. And sure enough, there I went to what they call the Burmese temple, they still use that term. It was full of pictures from the so-called Saffron Revolution. I met some monks from Myanmar that had managed to escape, and they told me that politicized monks from Sri Lanka had actually been to Myanmar before the Saffron Revolution to tell them how to conduct the mass movement. I was quite astonished to hear that. But I think it's there we have to look at the links. And historically, of course, the Sangha in Myanmar has been a powerful force, first against British colonialism. I mean, the first leader of any kind of nationalist movement was mentioning in Myanmar was Otama, who was a Buddhist monk. He was very close to Mahatma Gandhi, and he was inspired by civil disobedience and peaceful means and that sort of thing. But gradually, of course, the Sangha became more and more militant. And I remember when I went through old police records from colonial days, compiled by the British Special Branch in Calcutta, they had a special chapter there on communists in Burma, there was in those days, and it was half of them were monks. And they said, this is very dangerous spongy. Spongy, of course, is a monk. And then after independence, the government of Unu, who was deeply religious, he depended on support of the Sangha. And when the military took over in 1962, one of the first things the military tried to do at that time was actually to control the Sangha, establishing a entirely new structure to make sure the monks did not rebel. But they did. They took part in the 1974 when Utans came back for funeral from New York. His body was brought back to Myanmar for funeral in 1974, and the monks came out in force against the military government in support of Utan, who was a very critical of Malayalam critical of Levy's military government. Then you have the 1988 uprising. The thousands of monks all over the country marched together with pro-democracy demonstrations. But then in more recent years, the Myanmar military has tried to win the Sangha over to their side. And to some extent, they have actually succeeded. And they've done that by approaching some old, very senior adults. They've given them little presents, new cars, television sets, and so on. And they managed to get some adults who speak out in favor of the military. But it doesn't mean that the Sangha is entirely under military control. It's still growing under the surface. And many monks, especially young monks, remain fiercely opposed to military rule. It's only a matter of time before you can see them out in the streets again. If there is another outburst of, anti-military, anger in the country, demonstrations, whatever, the monks certainly be there. That is the main worry for the military, more than the civilian politicians. It's easy to control them. To control the monks, it's not that easy. They have their own code of conduct.
Right. So do you see any, meaningful change in the civil-military relations emerging from this election? Do you think there's, another outburst of anti-junta sentiment brewing in the country?
Well, I think, first of all, when these elections are being held, not because the military wants to share power with everybody else, and because they want to give up power. No, they want to remain in power. But I would not be surprised if they sort of give me some token gestures to show that things are a bit better now. And to some extent, we can already see that even now. I did it in curfew in Yangon a couple of days ago, and they will probably do something else to make it think this election look a little bit better than it is. But I don't think they want to repeat the mistake of 2010. After that election, when they really opened up the country, at least political prisoners, allow political parties to operate freely, there was a free press and so on. They just went out of control. So that's why the military had to step in and reassert the grip on the state. Well, we had the 2015 election when the NLD won, and they actually agreed with the NLD forming the government. And then you had the 2020, when the NLD won an even more massive landslide victory. And I think then the military decided enough is enough, and then it was a coup. But you also have to remember that even during that period, those 10 years of openness, I would say from 2011 to 2021, there was actually a transition to democracy, as many, especially Western academics, claim it was. Because everything happened within the parameters of the 2008 Constitution. And that Constitution guaranteed the supreme power of the military. That was never touched at all. remember the initiatives, and those were quite important because they changed, in many ways, the way the Myanmar society functioned. Suddenly, a whole generation can use the freedoms which they and their parents never enjoyed before. And I was, as you know, blacklisted in Myanmar for many years. But in 2012, I was allowed back in again. And for several years after that, I taught investigative journalism in Yangon. And I was really impressed with these young Myanmar people of different nationalities. But they were smart. They knew what they were talking about. They asked me questions which were very relevant. And they came with ideas which was fantastic. And there was something new. And I think there was among the journalists. And then you had all the other NGOs which were set up at that time and so on. So there was an entirely new Myanmar emerged during the period of openness. And I think that was a major reason why the military decided to step in and reassert the control of the state in 2021. But the outcome, of course, was that thousands of young people refused to accept this new military order. They took to the jungles and the mountains to fight against the junta. And many of them are still there. So that is what happened. There was a transformation of Myanmar society, not a transition to some kind of democracy that happened during those 10 years.
Right. So for outside observers outside of Myanmar looking in, there are two more phases left. What should they be watching closely in the upcoming phases of the election?
Well, first of all, where those elections are going to be held, because we don't really know what they are. I don't think the Myanmar military has made up their mind where the elections can be held, can be held or not. So that's one thing. And the other one is, of course, when are the results going to be made public? And how credible will they be? Well, that is the big question. We don't know yet. Because this is not a ballot paper. This is kind of electronic voting. That's very easy to manipulate. But I think there's no doubt, in my mind at least, that the USDP, the Unison Democratic Development Party, will win. It will be a new government, supposedly made up of civilians, but those civilians most of them will be former military officers. And then we have to wait and see what this new government will do in order to improve its image internationally. And then there may be some concessions, but nothing that's actually going to challenge the supreme power. There will be some goodwill gestures just to get the international community, and especially the countries which have recognized the outcome of the election, make them feel a bit better too.
Right. And in January, the International Court of Justice will be hearing a case accusing Myanmar of genocide against the Rohingya community. How does this legal development, say, intersect with the timing of these elections? And do you see the elections having any, direct or indirect impact on how Myanmar presents itself to the world at large?
Well, Myanmar is already pretty bad. So I don't know if it's going to have a major impact on the situation in the country. But if you look at the Rohingya issue, it's a very important issue because no one in Myanmar really wants to see the Rohingyas come back. When I say no one, I'm talking about the pro-democracy forces as well as the military. Can you imagine that there is a popular, really hypothetically, democratically elected government in power in Naypyidaw? They decided to let the Rohingyas come back, a million of them, and even more, to take into account those who are living in Malaysia and other countries, Thailand. That government will lose its popular support in India. The anti-Rohingya sentiment is that strong. The military doesn't want them back either. So unfortunately, I think they're stuck there in Bangladesh. And it's a very dangerous, potentially very dangerous situation because even Bangladesh officials I've talked to are pretty worried about that. Because in 2017, that's where the major influx was. That's now, will be soon be 9 years ago. Those who were 10 years old at that time, they are 18, 19 now. Those who were 15, they are in the 20s. There's a lot of angry young men in those camps. They can easily be radicalized and taken advantage of by groups which most people would describe as extremists. It has already happened to some extent. But on the other hand, what some of the Bangladesh officials are saying it is private. We are stuck with the Palestine kind of situation on our hands. A permanent depopulation, it can easily be radicalized and will destabilize even the political situation inside Bangladesh. That is a major issue which the Bangladesh government have to tackle. And so far they haven't really done much about it, because there's not much they can do at the moment. But it is an issue which is certainly going to have an impact on the situation, more in Bangladesh than in Myanmar, because no one in Myanmar wants to attack Bangladesh. But we have to make one addition to that here. It is not necessarily an anti-Muslim thing, because 5% roughly of the population of Myanmar, they're Muslims. And most of them are of Indian origin from the subcontinent. They live in urban areas. Most of them are merchants. I just walked down Sulapagoda Road in Yangon, where all the mobile telephone shops are, mostly run by Muslims of Indian extraction. They have Burmese names, they speak Burmese. Yes, there's some prejudice and so on, but it's not a major issue. So they are they're also Myanmar citizens. And they speak, most of them even in Myanmar Burmese names, they speak Burmese. The Rohingyas are different. They're a rural community, and which lives on the border, next to the borders of the country, where they speak the same dialect of Bengali on the other side. I mean, they usually call Bengalis. Yes, frankly speaking, yes, they are. They are Bengali origin. But they say, well, they don't speak the same language as they do in Dhaka, Calcutta. No, they don't. Because they speak the Chittagoni dialect. That one dialect is very different from Bengali spoken in the Dhaka or in Calcutta. But they're a rural community. Most of them are fairly uneducated. They don't have Burmese names. They don't speak Burmese. And therefore, very few people in Myanmar are willing to accept them as citizens. Of course, they can say that they live in abundance. So yes, they have no doubt about it. But it doesn't make any difference to them. They're still very different from other Muslim communities in the country. And that is why this Rohingya issue is not going to be resolved in a time soon at all. And the main problem there, the main burden really, is here is on Bangladesh rather than Myanmar. But they're not coming back.
I think this is a good place to end our recording. And I got all my answers I was looking for. So thank you so much for your time, Mr. Lintner. I hope you have a great day.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Would you like to talk about something else that I think has interested you about this first phase?
In big verdicts, but there's no real way of enforcing this unless the UN's Security Council decides to do something. That is not going to happen because both China and Russia are permanent members of the Security Council, and they're going to veto any such attack. So therefore, I am not paying that much attention to what's happening in The Hague. It's not going to have much impact on the situation in the country. And maybe we should add a few words about the Russian history. And that is interesting, yeah, because the relations between the Myanmar military and China are very close. But it's not a happy relationship at all. If you look at it again historically, China has been an enemy for the Myanmar army, mainly through its massive support for the insurgent Communist Party of Burma from the late 1960s to the late 1970s. China put in more aid to the Communist Party of Burma effort than they did to any other so-called liberation movement or armed resistance outside Indochina. And the thousands of Myanmar soldiers died, killed by Chinese bullets. And it's a former Myanmar army officer told me, it's like a scar in our hearts. We know what the Chinese did to us. They're never going to forgive. The reason why the Myanmar military turned to China after the 1998 uprising and the sanctions and boycott which were introduced after that, they had no choice. China was the only country willing to provide them with any kind of support, trade, weapons, diplomatic support, and so on. But they were never particularly happy by this relationship. That is why they tried to diversify the international contacts and relationships. And then that's when Russia came into the picture. And Russia soon emerged as a major arms supplier to the Myanmar military. Thousands of Myanmar cadets went for training in Russia. They was basically to balance the heavy dependence of China. And to some extent, they managed to do that. But if you look at that relationship between Myanmar and Russia, it's not a particularly happy one either. But historically, culturally, socially, the Russians in Myanmar are very, very different. And all the Myanmar cadets are going to Russia for further education and training. I talked to some of them, and none of them told me that they were really happy in Moscow. They felt completely out of place. But nevertheless, it underscores this issue that the Myanmar military is very suspicious of the Chinese. They don't trust the Chinese. And they know that the Chinese have supplied wild weapons. And during the recent fighting, in the northern Shan Strait, the weapons used by the Kokal, the MNDA, the Palong, TNLA, all those weapons and the ammunition came from China. And there was actually a Myanmar army officer who made the public saying that once because he was so upset. And of course, there was a storm of criticism from China. They said, no, we have nothing to do with this. Of course, utter nonsense. So that relationship between China and Myanmar is not a very stable one. If the Myanmar military had some kind of alternatives, I think they would explore them. Russia, yes, they've done that. And now, of course, the president of Belarus was on a state visit to Myanmar as well. They even renamed a street in Naypyidaw after the capital of Belarus, Minsk. Just to show, this appreciation for that. But again, there's a relationship with socially, culturally, comes to religion and sort of thing. They're not natural allies. The Russians and the Myanmar, or the Belarusians and the Myanmar. Not at all. I think they're looking for other possibilities. And here I would say that India could play a role. But India is a neighbor, and despite some historical baggage there from the colonial days, India and Myanmar are natural allies, regardless of who is in power in the region. Much more than Russia or Belarus, most certainly than the West. But it also means that India would have to have a very comprehensive policy towards Myanmar, how to handle that new situation which will emerge after the election. That is not up to me to decide, but I can only watch it. There's one of the issues I am going to watch when the elections are over. How is India going to react to this new situation? But that is going to be more decisive than anything the West says, and it's certainly going to have an impact on China's influence in Myanmar as well.
And I think we'd love to have you again to report on your observations about how India is dealing with Myanmar. For now, I think that's all I have. Thank you so much for spending with us. Yes, that's lovely. Thank you. Thank you.
That brings us to the end of today's episode with Bertil Lintner. The CNSS podcast is brought to you by the Center for National Security Studies. The Center for National Security Studies was founded in 2023 as a multidisciplinary center of excellence for the study, research, and dissemination of subjects of non-traditional and traditional national security. CNSS was established by an MOU between MS Ramaiah University of Applied Sciences and Army Training Command. You can find out more about our work at cnss.msruas.ac.in.